champion. The game started with 1e4, c5. This is known as the Sicilian defense, a very aggressive defense. Knight f3, d6, d4, c takes d4, knight takes d4, knight f6, knight c3, and here Magnus decides to play g6, which is known as the dragon variation. Perhaps more common is this move, which is known as the Najdorf defense. Magnus plays g6, bishop e3, developing a bishop, bishop g7, and f3. This move is quite important. Dominguez needs to prevent Magnus from playing knight g4, then capturing the bishop on e3. And here Magnus plays a6, which is not the main move in the position. And we kind of have a hybrid between the dragon and the Najdorf, also known as the Dragendorf. Dominguez develops his queen because he wants to castle queenside. And here we see this h5 move from Magnus, which certainly looks strange at first sight. The point of this move is that he wants to prevent Dominguez from playing g4, which is a very common idea in these positions. White simply wants to launch a kingside attack against Black's king, and this move prevents it. So Dominguez decides to develop his bishop, knight bd7, Magnus develops his knight, long castle, and Magnus attacks Dominguez's bishop. Bishop e3, knight c5, putting more pieces into white position here, and putting the knight on a great square. Could also potentially take the bishop in the future. King b1, the king usually stands better on b1. Bishop b7, and here Dominguez plays rook e1. And we now notice that white has all of his pieces into the game. Rook c8 from Magnus, the rook into the open file. This is one of the reasons why the king moves, because he doesn't want to stay on the same file as the rook. And here Dominguez, he needs to find a plan, so he decides to put the bishop on g5. This is a slightly better square, while he can also sometimes play knight e5, and then also take on f6 with the bishop. Castles, and indeed in this position, we see this move, knight d5. Magnus doesn't like that knight, so he kicks it away with his pawn. And here there are some piece trades, knight takes f6, bishop takes f6, h4, bishop takes g5, h takes g5, and now it does look slightly even, doesn't it? Although the kings are on the opposite sides, it is pretty even. King d7 here, queen e3 from Dominguez. The queen is now also placed on a better square. Queen c7 from Magnus, and now rook d2. Dominguez, he has a plan, and that plan is to move that knight, so we then can double the rooks here and apply pressure on that pawn on d6. b4, Magnus wants to start an attack of his own. Rook d1 here, rook f8, and now queen f4, queen e7 from Magnus. It was important for him to prevent the white queen from entering on f6. Knight e2, we finally see this move attacking the pawn on d6, but Magnus, he simply doesn't care. He starts his own attack here with a5, and indeed it would not be so clever taking that rook, because after captures Magnus's attack here, it gets quite dangerous after a4. And in this case, there's also a tactical motive. After bishop c4, knight takes e4. We see that the open file the file has been opened for the rook, and he's now attacking the bishop. So when Dominguez takes that knight, Magnus takes that bishop. So that's why Dominguez did not take that pawn. Instead, he went for e5, attacking the pawn on d6. Magnus cannot take this pawn because he will then lose a piece after queen takes, and he will take twice on d8 and then on c5. So Magnus, he is forced to block with d5, g4 from Dominguez. The bar is now, it does not like that move, but Dominguez wants to open up white's position. And while it not might have not been the best move from a human perspective, it is certainly a very logical move. Magnus decides to take that pawn, and Dominguez plays queen f6 check. Does look dangerous after takes, g takes f6. And here Magnus plays king h6, and we now see the bar. The bar is going nuts here on the left side of the board. And what is going on here? Apparently, there is a move which will make Dominguez win the game here, and that is rook d4. And the point is that this king will be checkmated. If it tries the logical move g5 to get an extra square for his king, Dominguez will simply take this pawn, and then he will play knight f4 next, forcing black to take, and then the mate will be inevitable on h1. Let me just show that real quick. So a4, knight f4, rook h1 is a threat. Black's forced to take, but this opens up this file for the rook, which means that rook h1 is checkmate. So rook d4 would have won the game for Dominguez, but Dominguez, he did not see it. It is a very difficult move to see, and instead he plays rook h1, king g5, f4, king f5, and this king is looking awfully trapped here. But where is the mate? Where is the mate? The clock is also ticking down for Lanier Dominguez Perez in this position, and he just simply decides to play rook f1, protecting the pawn in f4. He's threatening knight g3 and knight d4, but it doesn't help. g5 here, g5, and now Magnus's king gets the g6 square. So after knight d4 check, king g6, f5, e takes f5, and knight takes f5, it is certainly still looking dangerous for the world champion. There are mating threats here with knight e7 check and rook h2, for example, but the world champion has seen it all. He simply plays g3, which is an excellent move, and there are no threats. There is no rook h2, there is no knight e7, and because the king escapes to h5 and g4, and all of a sudden there's no mate. So instead, Dominguez feels like he's forced to play rook g2 to try to attack and win the pawn on g3, knight e4, knight takes g3, rook e8, and these pawns have now become awfully weak, and it is very difficult for Dominguez to defend those. He takes the pawn and then plays e6. This forces Magnus to take it. Then f7, followed by bishop takes e6. Dominguez has seen all of this, and it does look like he has some sort of compensation. It's not that easy for the world champion, but the world champion, he wants to support this pawn and then promote it. So what he does is that he puts the rook on c5 in order to put the rook on e5 and then pushing the pawns. Dominguez puts the rook on g3. Perhaps he wants to double the rooks or play rook e3. Rook e5, bishop g4, e3 from Magnus. Dominguez was unable to play rook e3, so instead he plays king c1 in order to stop the pawn on e3. Magnus can now finally take the pawn on f7. Rook takes, king takes, and Dominguez needs to defend yet another position. Not very fun. Let's see if he can hold it. King e1, bishop d5, a3, takes. Now these pawns have also become slightly weaker, but it's not easy for Magnus to win. So what happens here is that we get a trade, and this means that now there are not a lot of pieces left on the board, and the position is still required some conversion. There is a major gimmick with this position, and that is that if white is able to capture this pawn while at the same time keep his king near this a1 square, to get his king on this a1 square, the game ends in a draw, because this pawn promotes to a black square and this bishop is only on light squares, which means that this king can simply move to these two squares, a1 and b2, and it is impossible for black to remove the king, which means that it is a theoretical draw. So it is not easy for the world champion to win. He cannot simply run down with the pawn, so he needs to find a way to make that happen. But let's see if he's able to do it. Bishop g6, bishop f1, bishop h5. They're kind of moving back and forth here. Magnus wants to put lane here in a sort of Zugzwang. And now he finally moves the pawn. And remember the gimmick. It is not easy, right? But the gimmick, right? The king needs to be close to this a1 square, and the king on f4 is very, very far away from a1, which means that Magnus decides to simply sacrifice the pawn because he thinks that he's going to be able to take that pawn, and he thinks that neither the bishop or the king will be able to stop this pawn. King takes g4, king c3, king f5, and king b2, and look at the evaluation bar. The evaluation bar says that after a clear victory for Magnus, it says that it's now officially a draw, but this is not easy, and Dominguez is awfully low on time, and he makes this king e5 move, which does lose the game. He had to simply play king f4 and then king e3, try to get as close as possible with his king, and even that was a mistake. He actually has to play bishop e2 here first, because if black plays a4, we can then play bishop d1. That is the point. So the king is forced to move here with, for example, king b4. But then Dominguez can play bishop d1, preventing black from playing a4. And there will be some back and forth here, but it's not easy for Magnus to advance this pawn, and this position is a theoretical draw because now this king is able to get a lot closer to the pawn, while this bishop also stops the pawn in time. But we will see in the game, the king here, it is simply too far away. It is too far away, and the king should have been here on a1, but it's there on c5 instead. And now the pawn can simply march down the board, and it is going to be a victory from the world champion. He has to be careful though. He cannot play a2 because this bishop is protecting this square, so he needs to find a way to remove the bishop from the diagonal. So he plays bishop b1 followed by bishop a2, and now Dominguez is forced to go out of the diagonal. Bishop b1, a last trick, because if black takes the bishop, I will take the pawn. But no, Magnus does not fall for the trick. He plays simply bishop b3, and here Dominguez resigns because he is forced to move the king or the bishop. The king will allow black to take the bishop, and moving the bishop will allow black to promote. So the game is over. Dominguez had his chance with rook d4 earlier, but in the end, the world champion came on top. And he has now won 4 games in a row. He is really on a roll. A fantastic game.